Welcome, dear listeners, to a journey through time, a journey that will take us back to one of the most transformative periods in European history. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let your mind drift back to the 14th century, to a world very different from our own. The year is 1347. The season is autumn. Ships are arriving at ports across the Mediterranean, their wooden hulls creaking softly against stone harbors, their sails heavy with the salt of distant seas. But these vessels carry more than trade goods and weary sailors. They carry something invisible, something that will change the course of European civilization forever. This is the story of the Black Death, the Great Mortality, the pestilence that swept across Europe like a dark tide, touching every corner of the continent, every village, every city, every castle and cathedral. It is a story of suffering, yes, but also of resilience, of human nature revealed in its most desperate hours, of a world transformed. So settle in, dear listener, breathe deeply, and let us begin this journey together, following the path of the plague as it wound its way through medieval Europe, leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. To understand the Black Death's journey across Europe, we must first travel eastward, far eastward, to the vast steppes of Central Asia, where nomadic peoples had roamed for centuries beneath endless skies. It was here, in this seemingly empty landscape, that the bacterium Yersinia pestis made its home, nestled quietly in the burrows of ground squirrels and marmots, carried by fleas so small they could barely be seen, waiting for the perfect moment to begin its terrible journey. The plague had been stirring in Asia for decades, perhaps centuries, moving slowly through trade routes, following the ancient Silk Road like a shadow. It touched the great cities of Central Asia first: Samarkand, Bukhara, places where East met West in bustling bazaars filled with silk and spices, gold and precious stones. Imagine, if you will, a merchant caravan, camels swaying gently under heavy loads, their bells chiming softly in the desert air. The merchants travel for months through mountain passes where the wind whistles cold and sharp, across vast plains where the grass waves like a green sea. They stop at caravanserais, those beautiful stone buildings that offered shelter to travelers, their courtyards echoing with a dozen languages, their storerooms filled with goods from every corner of the known world. But in the grain stores, in the corners where shadows gathered, tiny fleas were waiting, and when the caravans moved on, the fleas moved with them, hidden in bales of cloth, nestled in sacks of grain, patient as only nature can be patient. By the 1330s, the plague had reached China, sweeping through the populous regions with devastating effect. Chinese records speak of entire districts emptied, of fields lying fallow because there were no hands to tend them, of cities where the only sounds were the wind and the crying of abandoned children. From China, the plague followed the maritime trade routes, moving like water through the interconnected network of merchants and sailors that bound the medieval world together. It traveled to India, to the Middle East, to the great trading cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. And then, in the year 1346, it reached the shores of the Black Sea. On the northern shores of the Black Sea stood the city of Kaffa, known today as Feodosia, a bustling Genoese trading post where the wealth of Asia met the ambitions of Europe. Its walls rose white against the dark water, its harbors filled with ships from Venice and Genoa, Constantinople and Trebizond. In 1346, Kaffa found itself under siege, not by plague, but by war. The Mongol Golden Horde, led by Khan Jani Beg, had surrounded the city, their horsemen like a dark ring around the pale walls. For months, the siege continued, the attackers growing ever more desperate as winter approached, the defenders growing ever more weary as their supplies dwindled. But then, something changed. Something that would alter the course of history forever. The plague had arrived in the Mongol camp. At first it might have seemed like a blessing to the defenders, watching their enemies fall ill, seeing the siege lines grow thin as soldiers abandoned their posts. But Jani Beg, whether from desperation or from some dark inspiration, ordered his men to gather the bodies of the plague dead and to load them into their great catapults. Can you imagine the scene, dear listener? The wooden arms of the siege engines groaning as they were pulled back, the horrible thud as the diseased corpses struck the walls, the terror of the defenders as they realized what was falling among them like some nightmare rain. This may have been one of the first recorded instances of biological warfare in human history. The dead, launched over the walls of Kaffa, brought the living plague into the heart of the city. The siege ended not with victory or defeat, but with mutual destruction. The Mongols retreated, their forces decimated by disease. The Genoese, too, were dying, but some managed to reach their ships in the harbor. They loaded what goods they could, gathered what crew remained healthy, and set sail for home. They were fleeing the plague, but unknowingly they carried it with them in the holds of their ships, in the grain that fed their crews, in the very air they breathed. The Black Death traveled westward, toward Europe, toward a continent utterly unprepared for what was coming. And so began the Black Death's journey across Europe, not with armies or conquest, but with merchants fleeing for their lives, carrying death in their wake like a dark tide following the moon. October, the month when the Mediterranean begins to turn from summer blue to winter gray, when the first storms gather strength in the western reaches, when wise sailors begin to think of harbor and home. In October of 1347, 12 ships limped into the port of Messina on the island of Sicily. These were Genoese vessels, their hulls weathered by the long journey from the Black Sea, their sails patched and repatched by crews growing ever more desperate. The people of Messina gathered at the harbor, as they always did when foreign ships arrived, eager for news, for trade, for the excitement that came with visitors from distant lands. But as the ships drew closer, something seemed wrong. Too few men on deck, too little shouting and celebration, too much silence where there should have been the busy sounds of a crew preparing to dock. When the gangplanks were lowered, when the first sailors stumbled ashore, the horror became clear. These men were dying, or already dead. Their skin was dark with strange marks. Their breath came in ragged gasps. Their eyes held the terrible knowledge of those who have seen too much death. The authorities of Messina, showing wisdom that would prove all too rare in the months to come, ordered the ships to leave immediately. "Leave our harbor," they cried, "and take your sickness with you." But it was already too late. The plague had made its first landfall in Europe. From Messina, it spread quickly across Sicily, following the ancient Roman roads that still connected city to village, market town to monastery. The island's position in the center of the Mediterranean, its role as a crossroads of trade, made it the perfect launching point for the plague's assault on the continent. Meanwhile, those same 12 ships, driven from Messina, continued their deadly journey. Some sailed north to Genoa, their home port, carrying the plague to the heart of one of Europe's greatest trading cities. Others traveled west to Marseille, to Barcelona, to ports along the Spanish coast. Each arrival was the same, ships full of the dead and dying, crews who had watched their comrades fall one by one during the long voyage, harbors that welcomed trade but received only death. And with each arrival, the plague established a new foothold, a new center from which it could spread inland, following the rivers and roads, the pilgrimage routes and trade paths that connected medieval Europe like arteries in a vast living body. Chapter 4: The Italian Peninsula. Death in the City-States. From the ports of the Mediterranean, the Black Death began its inexorable advance into the heart of Europe. And nowhere was this advance more devastating than in the wealthy city-states of Italy. Italy in 1347 was a land of contradictions. Great wealth alongside grinding poverty, magnificent art alongside brutal warfare, cities that gleamed like jewels: Florence, Venice, Milan, Pisa, each one a center of learning and culture, of banking and trade. The plague reached Genoa in November of 1347, carried by the very ships that had fled from Messina. Genoa, the proud maritime republic, whose merchants had established trading posts from Constantinople to Crimea, whose bankers funded kings and financed crusades. Picture, if you will, the narrow streets of medieval Genoa, climbing steeply from the harbor toward the hills, lined with tall houses whose upper stories nearly touched across the cobblestones. In these crowded quarters, where large families shared small spaces, where the air was thick with the smells of cooking and commerce, where people lived pressed close together like flowers in a garden, the plague found perfect conditions. From Genoa, the disease spread along the coastal trade routes, reaching Pisa, then following the Arno River inland toward Florence. Each city it touched became a new center of infection, a new point from which the plague radiated outward like ripples on a dark pond. In Florence, that jewel of the Renaissance, the Black Death arrived in the spring of 1348. This was the Florence of Dante, of Giotto, of the great banking families who had made the city wealthy beyond measure. Its population had swelled to perhaps 100,000 souls, artisans and merchants, nobles and clergy, all living within the embrace of those famous walls. Giovanni Boccaccio, the great writer, was there to witness what happened next. In his Decameron, he wrote of streets emptied of all but the dead and dying, of families destroyed in a matter of days, of social order collapsing as people fled or barricaded themselves in their homes. How many valiant men, Boccaccio wrote, how many fair women, how many fine young fellows breakfasted with their relatives and friends in the morning, and that very evening dined with their ancestors in the other world. The plague showed no mercy, no distinction between rich and poor, noble and peasant, young and old. It struck down bishops and beggars with equal ferocity, leaving behind a city transformed, a population reduced by perhaps half, a way of life forever changed. From Florence, the plague continued its march northward, reaching Venice in early 1348. Venice, La Serenissima, the most serene republic, whose merchants had made her the bridge between East and West, whose fleets controlled the eastern Mediterranean, whose palaces rose like dreams from the waters of the lagoon. But even Venice, protected by water, isolated from the mainland, could not escape. The plague arrived in her ships, in her warehouses, in the very goods that had made her wealthy. The great trading galleys that had carried silk and spices from Alexandria and Constantinople now carried death to the most beautiful city in the world. Imagine the scene. The Grand Canal empty of its usual traffic, the Rialto market silent, the great palaces shuttered and still, where once there had been the constant sound of voices, of commerce, of life. Now there was only the lapping of water against stone, and the occasional tolling of bells for the dead. While Italy suffered under the plague's grip, the disease was not content to remain south of the Alps, those great mountains that had seemed to medieval minds like the very spine of Europe, rising white and terrible against the sky, their peaks crowned with eternal snow, their passes guarded by ancient fortresses. Even they could not stop the Black Death's advance. The plague crossed the Alps as it had crossed the Mediterranean, carried by the very people who sought to flee from it, merchants traveling to the great fairs of Champagne, pilgrims returning from Rome, soldiers marching to new campaigns, all unknowingly became carriers of the disease they feared. The great passes, the Brenner, the St. Gothard, the Mont Cenis, had for centuries been the pathways of invasion and trade, of cultural exchange and political alliance. Roman legions had marched through these defiles. Charlemagne's armies had crossed these heights. And now, in the spring of 1348, the Black Death followed the same ancient routes. Picture, dear listener, a merchant caravan winding its way through one of these passes, the pack horses picking their way carefully along narrow paths carved into the mountainside, their hooves echoing off the stone walls that rose on either side. The air is thin here, cold even in summer, and the travelers pull their cloaks close as they navigate the treacherous turns. They are fleeing the plague, seeking safety in the lands beyond the mountains. But some among them already carry the seeds of the disease, feeling perhaps only a slight fever, a touch of weariness that they attribute to the difficulty of the journey. By the time they reach the far side of the mountains, by the time they enter the green valleys of southern Germany or eastern France, the plague has crossed with them. And so, by the summer of 1348, the Black Death had breached Europe's great mountain barrier. From the Alpine passes, it spread into the Holy Roman Empire, into the patchwork of duchies and kingdoms that made up medieval Germany, into the prosperous trading cities of the Rhine. From the Mediterranean port of Marseille, the Black Death began its advance into the heart of France, following the ancient pathway of the Rhone River, that great waterway that had carried Roman legions and crusader armies, merchant ships and pilgrim barges, northward toward the interior of the continent. The Rhone Valley in 1348 was a ribbon of prosperity, vineyards climbing the hillsides, fields of grain stretching golden in the summer sun, towns and cities strung along the river like pearls on a thread. Lyon, Vienne, Avignon, each one a center of trade and culture, each one about to face its greatest trial. The plague reached Avignon in January of 1348, and here, in this city that served as the seat of the papal court, the Black Death encountered the very heart of medieval Christendom. Pope Clement VI, the sixth of that name, found himself ruling over a church in crisis. Priests were dying alongside their flocks. Bishops were falling as quickly as peasants, and the people looked to their Holy Father for answers that even he could not provide. Yet Clement showed remarkable courage in these dark days. While many fled the plague, while cities emptied and courts scattered, the Pope remained in Avignon, ministering to the sick, organizing relief efforts, trying to maintain some semblance of order in a world that seemed to be collapsing. The papal court, usually a place of ceremony and splendor, became a center of desperate activity. Physicians were summoned from across Europe, though their knowledge proved pitifully inadequate against the plague. Prayers were offered day and night. Processions wound through the streets carrying holy relics, but still the death toll mounted. From Avignon, the plague continued its journey northward, reaching Lyon in the spring, then spreading into the surrounding countryside. The great fairs of Champagne, those gatherings that had made France the commercial center of Northern Europe, became instead centers of contagion as merchants from infected regions mingled with traders from areas not yet touched by the disease. Picture a medieval fair, tents and pavilions spread across a great field, merchants displaying their wares on wooden tables, the air filled with the sounds of bargaining and celebration. Wool from England, wine from Gascony, furs from the Baltic, spices from the East, all changing hands in the complex dance of medieval commerce. But now, in the summer of 1348, the atmosphere was different. Fewer travelers arrived each day. Those who came spoke in hushed tones of the disasters they had witnessed, of cities emptied, of roads abandoned. The plague was spreading through the very networks that had made medieval Europe prosperous, turning the bonds of trade into chains of death. Across the English Channel, that narrow strip of water that had protected England from so many invasions, the island kingdom watched with growing anxiety as reports reached them of the plague's advance across the continent. England in 1348 was a land of contrasts. Great estates worked by villains and serfs, prosperous wool towns whose merchants grew rich on the export trade, ancient forests where nobles hunted deer and wild boar, cathedral cities where monks preserved the learning of ages. King Edward III, in the midst of his long war with France, his great victory at Crécy still fresh in memory, must have thought that his island realm was safe, protected by the very waters that had shielded England from Viking raids and Norman conquests. But the plague, like the merchants who carried it, knew no borders, respected no natural barriers. In the summer of 1348, ships began arriving at English ports, ships from Gascony, from Calais, from the Low Countries, carrying not just goods and passengers, but the seeds of England's greatest disaster. The plague is believed to have first reached England at Melcombe Regis, now part of Weymouth in Dorset. It was late June, the height of the trading season, when a ship from Gascony, laden with wine and other goods, arrived at this busy port. The crew seemed healthy enough when they docked. The cargo was unloaded without incident. The ship's business was concluded in the normal way, but within days, the first cases appeared in the town. A mysterious illness that struck quickly and killed with terrifying efficiency. From Dorset, the plague spread rapidly across southern England, following the roads that led to Winchester, to London, to the great ports and market towns that connected England to the wider world. By autumn, it had reached Bristol, that great western port whose merchants traded with Ireland and Iceland, with Spain and Portugal. Bristol, built on the profits of wool and wine, its harbour filled with ships from a dozen nations, became one of the plague's most important footholds in England. From here, the disease could spread both into the Welsh hills and across the Irish Sea, carrying death to lands that had never known such devastation. And like a dark tide, the plague crept ever closer to London, to the greatest city in England, to the seat of kings and the centre of English power, the capital, with its 80,000 inhabitants, its narrow streets and crowded houses, its great cathedral and royal palace, awaited its turn to face the Black Death. London in 1348 was the beating heart of England, a city of perhaps 80,000 souls, the largest in the kingdom, a place where royal court and merchant guild, cathedral and marketplace existed in constant, bustling proximity. Picture, dear listener, medieval London, its narrow streets winding between timber-framed houses, their upper stories jutting out over the cobblestones, their windows filled with the soft glow of candlelight, the great cathedral of St. Paul's, its spire reaching toward heaven, dominated the skyline, while the Tower of London, that fortress palace by the Thames, stood guard over the eastern approaches. The river itself, the Thames, was the city's lifeline, crowded with boats and barges, wherries carrying passengers from bank to bank, great ships bringing goods from every corner of Europe. London Bridge, that marvel of medieval engineering, spanned the river with its shops and houses, its chapel dedicated to St. Thomas Becket, its gates guarded by the severed heads of traitors. Into this crowded, vibrant, bustling metropolis, the Black Death arrived in the autumn of 1348. It may have come by ship up the Thames from the Channel ports, or by road, carried by merchants fleeing the devastation in the south. However it arrived, its impact was immediate and devastating. The plague struck London like a hammer blow. In the cramped quarters of the city, where families crowded together in single rooms, where neighbours lived pressed against neighbours, where the very air seemed thick with the breath of humanity. The disease found perfect conditions for its terrible work. The royal court, which had been in residence at Westminster, fled almost immediately. King Edward and his nobles, his clerks and servants, abandoned the capital for the safer air of the countryside, leaving London to face its trial alone. But not everyone could flee. The merchants in their guild halls, the craftsmen in their workshops, the priests in their parishes, the common people in their hovels, all remained, bound by duty or circumstance, to stay and face whatever came. And what came was destruction beyond anything the city had ever known. The death toll mounted daily, hourly, as families were swept away entire, as trades and crafts lost their masters, as parishes found themselves without priests, as the very structure of urban life began to collapse. The existing cemeteries, those small churchyards that had served London for centuries, quickly became overwhelmed. New burial grounds had to be consecrated. Great pits dug to receive the endless procession of the dead. At Smithfield, at Spitalfields, mass graves were opened, and the dead were laid to rest, not in individual graves with proper ceremony, but in common burial, their names lost, their stories silenced forever. Pause. By the time the plague's grip on London began to loosen, in the spring of 1349, the city had been transformed. Perhaps half its population lay dead. Whole districts stood empty. Trades and crafts faced extinction as masters and apprentices alike had perished. The greatest city in England had been brought to its knees by an enemy it could neither see nor fight. From England, the Black Death continued its relentless advance, pushing northward toward Scotland, toward those wild borderlands where English and Scots had fought for generations, where ancient castles stood guard over mountain passes and river crossings. The Scots, watching the devastation unfold in England, may have thought themselves fortunate, perhaps even blessed by God, to see their ancient enemies brought so low. Some even called it the foul death of the English, believing that divine justice was at work, that the plague would respect the border between the kingdoms. But the plague, as we have seen, knew no borders, recognized no boundaries of language or loyalty. In 1349, as Scottish armies gathered to take advantage of England's weakness. They carried the disease with them into their own land. Picture the scene. Scottish warriors in their mail and leather, their weapons gleaming in the pale northern light, gathering in the border towns to plan their raids. They had heard of the devastation to the south, of English armies disbanded, of castles left unguarded, and they saw opportunity in England's disaster. But among these warriors, among the camp followers and merchants who attended their armies, the plague was already spreading. Men who had seemed healthy when they crossed the border began to fall ill, to develop the terrible symptoms that had become so familiar to the South. The Scottish army, instead of conquering English territory, found itself fighting a different enemy, one that could not be defeated with sword and spear, with castle and siege engine. The plague struck the Scottish forces as they gathered, scattering them not in defeat but in death, sending the survivors fleeing northward, carrying the disease deeper into Scotland. From the borderlands, the plague spread into the Scottish Highlands, following the great river valleys, climbing toward the mountains where clans had dwelt for centuries in their stone towers and thatched halls. The disease found the scattered settlements, the monastery schools, the market towns, pursuing its deadly work even in the most remote glens and islands. Edinburgh, the royal burgh, Stirling with its great castle, Glasgow on the Clyde, all felt the plague's touch. Scotland, which had survived English invasions and Viking raids, which had maintained its independence through centuries of warfare, found itself helpless before this new enemy. And still the plague moved onward, crossing the North Sea to Norway, to Denmark, following the ancient trade routes that connected the Baltic to the Atlantic, carrying death to lands that had never known such devastation, to peoples who had no name for what was destroying them. In the heart of Europe, in the patchwork of duchies and kingdoms that made up the Holy Roman Empire, the Black Death encountered a land already fractured by political division, religious conflict, and social tension. The empire in 1348 was a realm in name only, its emperor holding theoretical authority over a vast territory that stretched from the Baltic to the Alps, from the Rhine to the borders of Poland. But real power lay with the great nobles, the prince-electors, the wealthy trading cities, each jealous of their rights and privileges, each suspicious of their neighbors. into this fragmented world. The plague arrived like a conquering army, sweeping across borders that meant nothing to disease, bringing death to castle and cottage alike, to imperial city and peasant village. The plague reached the Rhineland in the summer of 1348, carried by merchants fleeing the devastation in France and Italy. The great trading cities of the Rhine, Cologne, Mainz, Strasbourg, had grown wealthy on the commerce that flowed along Europe's greatest river. But now that same commerce brought them death. Cologne, the largest city in Germany, with its magnificent cathedral rising slowly toward the sky, its walls enclosing perhaps 50,000 souls, faced the plague with the same helplessness that had marked other great cities. The disease struck all levels of society, from the wealthy merchants in their stone houses to the craftsmen in their workshops, from the clergy in their monasteries to the beggars in the streets. But in Germany, the plague's arrival coincided with something even more terrible. A wave of persecution that swept through the Jewish communities of the Rhineland and beyond. As the death toll mounted, as people searched desperately for someone to blame, for some explanation for the horror that had befallen them, they turned their fury on their Jewish neighbors. Accusations flew that the Jews had poisoned the wells, that they had caused the plague through sorcery, that they were somehow responsible for the devastation. These charges were false, completely without foundation, the product of fear and prejudice rather than reason. But in the atmosphere of terror that gripped the plague-stricken cities, reason was in short supply. In Mainz, in Cologne, in dozens of smaller towns, Jewish communities that had existed for centuries were destroyed, their members murdered or driven into exile, their synagogues burned, their libraries scattered. The plague had brought not just death, but the collapse of the tolerance and coexistence that had marked medieval society at its best. From the Rhineland, the plague spread eastward, into Bavaria, into Austria, following the great river valleys and mountain passes that connected the German lands to the rest of Europe. Munich, Vienna, Prague, all felt the plague's touch. All saw their populations decimated, their societies transformed by the great mortality. As the plague spread across Central Europe, it encountered lands that were still, in many ways, on the frontier of Christendom, kingdoms where pagan traditions still lingered beneath the veneer of Christianity, where vast forests stretched unbroken for hundreds of miles, where the authority of distant kings was often more theoretical than real. Poland in 1348 was a kingdom in transition, recently united under the Piast dynasty. Its borders constantly shifting as it struggled with the Teutonic Knights to the north, with the Golden Horde to the east, with Hungarian and Bohemian claims to the south. It was a land of contrasts. Great estates worked by serfs, trading cities that grew wealthy on the Baltic commerce, vast wilderness where wolves and bears still roamed. The plague reached Poland from the west, carried by merchants and pilgrims, soldiers and refugees, all fleeing the devastation that had swept across Germany and Bohemia. But Poland's experience with the Black Death was different, perhaps unique in all of Europe, for reasons that historians still debate. Poland suffered far less than its neighbors. Perhaps it was the country's relative isolation, its sparse population, the fact that many of its settlements were small and scattered. Perhaps it was simple fortune, the random mercy of disease that spares one community while destroying another. Or perhaps, as some have suggested, it was the different nature of Polish society, the greater tolerance that had made Poland a refuge for Jews fleeing persecution elsewhere, the medical knowledge that Jewish physicians brought with them, the hygienic practices that may have slowed the plague's spread. Whatever the reason, Poland emerged from the Black Death as one of the few European kingdoms that had maintained its strength, its population, its institutions relatively intact. In the decades that followed, this would make Poland a haven for refugees from the devastated lands to the west, a center of recovery and renewal in a continent struggling to rebuild. Further north, along the Baltic coast, the plague found a different world entirely. The domain of the Teutonic Knights, those warrior monks who had carved out a crusader state in the forests of Prussia and Livonia, who ruled over a population of recently converted pagans with a mixture of military discipline and religious fervor. The Teutonic state, with its great castles and fortified towns, its efficient administration and German settlers, might have seemed well equipped to resist the plague. But disease, as we have seen, respects neither walls nor weapons, neither faith nor organization. The plague reached the Baltic ports in 1349, carried by ships from Lübeck and Hamburg, from Bergen and Stockholm. These northern cities with their timber houses and fish markets, their amber merchants and fur traders, had grown wealthy on the commerce that circled the Baltic like a golden chain. But now that same commerce brought them death. Riga, Tallinn, Königsberg, all the great ports of the Northern Sea felt the plague's touch. The Hanseatic League, that great trading confederation that had made the Baltic a German lake, found its commerce disrupted, its cities depopulated, its carefully constructed networks of trade and alliance strained to the breaking point. While the plague ravaged northern Europe, the Iberian Peninsula, that land of ancient kingdoms and ongoing reconquest, faced its own trial by fire. Spain and Portugal in 1348 were lands of constant warfare, where Christian kingdoms slowly pushed southward against the Muslim emirates of Andalusia, where the sound of church bells mingled with the call of the muezzin, where three great faiths existed in uneasy proximity. The plague reached Iberia through multiple routes, from the seaports of the Mediterranean, from the mountain passes of the Pyrenees, from the Atlantic harbors, where Portuguese fishermen brought their catch to market. By the spring of 1348, the disease had established footholds from Barcelona to Seville, from Lisbon to Valencia. Picture the great cities of medieval Spain, Córdoba with its magnificent mosque, Seville with its bustling river port, Toledo perched on its rocky hilltop above the Tagus, Barcelona looking out over the blue Mediterranean. These were cities where Islamic and Christian architecture stood side by side, where scholars translated Arabic texts into Latin, where merchants from 3 continents met to trade in silk and spices, silver and gold. But the plague recognized no distinction between mosque and cathedral, between Christian and Muslim and Jew. It struck down caliphs and kings with equal ferocity, bringing death to palace and hovel, to monastery and madrasa, to synagogue and church. In Seville, that great port on the Guadalquivir, where ships arrived daily from Genoa and Marseille, from North Africa and the Canary Islands, the plague found perfect conditions. The city's population, swollen by refugees from the countryside, packed into narrow streets that had been built for a smaller town, provided the close contact that the disease required. Alfonso XI of Castile, called the Avenger, was leading his armies in the siege of Gibraltar when the plague struck his camp. The king, who had spent his reign fighting the Moors, who had dreamed of completing the reconquest, fell victim not to enemy sword, but to invisible disease. His death, in March of 1350, symbolized the way the plague had disrupted all human plans, all earthly ambitions. In Portugal, that narrow kingdom pressed between Spain and the Atlantic, the plague followed the coastal settlements and river valleys inland. Lisbon, the royal capital, with its harbor full of ships bound for Africa and the Atlantic islands, became an early victim. The disease spread along the coast, reaching Oporto in the north, penetrating the mountainous interior where scattered villages had thought themselves safe from any earthly contagion. But Portugal, like Poland, would prove more resilient than many of its neighbors. Perhaps it was the kingdom's maritime orientation, its early experience with navigation and exploration, that helped it recover more quickly from the plague's devastation. In the decades that followed, Portuguese explorers would push ever further into the Atlantic, seeking new lands and new opportunities, in part driven by the need to replace what the plague had taken. From Iberia, the plague continued its global journey, crossing the Strait of Gibraltar to North Africa, following the ancient trade routes that connected Europe to the Islamic world, carrying its message of mortality to lands that had known conquest and defeat, prosperity and decline, but never devastation on quite this scale. In the far north of Europe, in those lands where winter night lasted for months, where the aurora borealis painted the sky in sheets of green and gold, where Viking longships had once carried both trade and terror to every corner of the known world, the Black Death arrived like a final winter, darker and colder than any in memory. Scandinavia in 1348 was a region of ancient kingdoms. Norway united under its royal house. Denmark controlling the entrance to the Baltic. Sweden slowly expanding its influence eastward into Finland and the Baltic provinces. These were lands where Christianity was still relatively new, where Thor's hammer and Christ's cross existed in uneasy combination, where the old ways died hard in remote forests and isolated fjords. The plague reached Norway first, carried by ships from England and the Low Countries, arriving at Bergen, that great port where the Hanseatic merchants had established their northern headquarters. Bergen, with its wooden houses climbing the hillsides above the harbor, its warehouses filled with stockfish and timber, furs and amber, had become the gateway between northern Europe and the Atlantic world. Picture Bergen in the autumn of 1349. The harbour filled with ships seeking shelter before the winter storms. Merchants hurrying to complete their business before the sea lanes closed. Fishermen bringing in their final catches before the dark months began. The air would have been sharp with salt and smoke, with the smell of tar and timber, with the 1,000 scents of maritime commerce. But among the familiar odors of the port, something else was stirring. Something that had traveled north from plague-stricken England. Something that would transform this prosperous trading city into a charnel house before the winter was done. From Bergen, the plague spread inland, following the fjords and valleys that penetrated deep into the Norwegian interior. It reached Trondheim, the ancient capital, where Norwegian kings had been crowned for centuries. It climbed into the mountains, finding isolated farms and settlements that had existed unchanged since the days of the Vikings. The sparse population of Norway, scattered across vast distances, might have been expected to slow the plague's advance, but the disease proved remarkably persistent, moving from farm to farm, village to village, carrying death even to the most remote corners of the kingdom. Sweden, across the mountains to the east, watched with growing alarm as reports reached Stockholm of the devastation in Norway and Denmark. The Swedish kingdom, with its iron mines and timber forests, its growing trade with the German cities of the Baltic, might have hoped that distance and the harsh northern climate would protect it. But the plague, as persistent as winter itself, found its way into Sweden through the Baltic ports, through Visby on the island of Gotland, through the great trading city of Stockholm. The disease spread along the river valleys, following the paths that had carried Viking raiders and Christian missionaries, medieval merchants and royal armies. Denmark, controlling the narrow straits that connected the North Sea to the Baltic, could not escape its position at the crossroads of northern commerce. The plague reached Copenhagen, reached the great cathedral city of Roskilde, spread through the islands and peninsulas that made up the Danish realm. King Valdemar IV, called the Restorer, who had spent his reign rebuilding Danish power after decades of weakness, found his kingdom devastated by an enemy he could not fight with sword or strategy. The population of Denmark, like that of its Scandinavian neighbors, was reduced by perhaps a third, maybe even half. in some regions. By 1350, the plague had completed its circuit of northern Europe, reaching even to Iceland, to the Faroe Islands, to the scattered settlements that marked the furthest extent of Norse civilization. The North, which had seemed so distant from the Mediterranean world where the plague began, had proven just as vulnerable as the crowded cities of Italy and France. The long polar night of 1349 to 1350 was darker than any in memory, not because the sun stayed hidden longer, but because so many hearth fires had been extinguished forever. So many voices had been silenced. So many lives had been cut short by the great mortality that had swept across Europe like a tide of darkness. By 1351, the Black Death's initial assault on Europe was largely complete. The plague would return again and again in subsequent decades, but never again with quite the same devastating force, never again to a population so completely unprepared for what was coming. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was a continent transformed, not just in population, but in its very soul. Perhaps a third of all Europeans had perished. In some regions, the death toll may have reached 50% or more. Entire villages had been abandoned, great cities reduced to shadows of their former selves. Noble houses extinguished, monastic communities scattered. But from this devastation, slowly, gradually, a new Europe began to emerge. The old certainties had been shattered, the old hierarchies disrupted, the old ways of thinking challenged by the magnitude of what had occurred. In the countryside, where so many peasants had died, the survivors found themselves in a new position. Labor, once abundant and cheap, had become scarce and valuable. Serfs, who had been bound to the land for generations, suddenly found lords competing for their services, offering better terms, higher wages, greater freedoms. The great manorial system, which had dominated European agriculture for centuries, began to crack and crumble. Peasants abandoned the worst lands, concentrated on the best, demanded payment in money rather than service. The Black Death had accomplished what centuries of peasant revolts had failed to achieve. It had begun the slow dissolution of serfdom. In the cities, the story was similar. The great guilds, which had controlled urban crafts and commerce with iron discipline, found their membership decimated. Young men who would never have been admitted to guild membership under the old system suddenly found themselves masters of trades, inheritors of businesses, holders of positions they could never have aspired to before the plague. Women who had lost husbands and fathers to the disease sometimes found themselves running businesses, managing estates, exercising authority that had previously been denied to them. The rigid social structure of medieval Europe, already under pressure from economic and political changes, was further loosened by the demographic catastrophe of the plague years. Perhaps nowhere was the transformation more profound than in the realm of religion and ideas. The medieval church, which had provided comfort and explanation for every aspect of human existence, found itself challenged by questions it could not answer. Why had God allowed such suffering? Why had the righteous perished alongside the wicked? Why had prayers and processions failed to halt the plague's advance? Some turned to extreme forms of religious devotion, the flagellants who whipped themselves in public processions, believing that human suffering might appease divine wrath. Others turned away from organized religion entirely, seeking meaning in philosophy, in mysticism, in the direct experience of the divine without priestly mediation. The certainties of medieval scholasticism, the great synthesis of faith and reason that had been built up over centuries, began to fragment. Thinkers like William of Ockham had already begun to question the relationship between divine and human knowledge, but the plague years accelerated this process, creating an intellectual crisis that would eventually contribute to the Renaissance and the Reformation. Economically, Europe had been fundamentally altered. The great trading networks that had connected the continent, while disrupted by the plague, eventually recovered and in some cases grew stronger. Cities that had lost population often found themselves wealthier per capita, with more resources available for each survivor. The shortage of labor, particularly skilled labor, drove technological innovation. Watermills and windmills, already common before the plague, became even more important as sources of power. New techniques in agriculture, in manufacturing, in construction, were developed to accomplish more work with fewer hands. The cultural impact of the Black Death was equally profound. Art and literature, once focused primarily on themes of divine glory and aristocratic splendor, began to grapple with themes of mortality, and human frailty. The dance of death, that artistic motif showing death claiming victims from every level of society, became a common subject for painters and sculptors. Writers like Boccaccio, who had witnessed the plague's devastation firsthand, created works that captured both the horror and the human resilience of the plague years. The Decameron, with its framed story of young people fleeing plague-stricken Florence, became one of the masterpieces of medieval literature, a work that looked both backward to the certainties that had been lost and forward to the new world that was being born. The Black Death had been more than just a medical catastrophe, more than just a demographic disaster. It had been a crisis of civilization, a moment when all of medieval Europe's assumptions about God and man, about society and nature, about life and death, had been called into question. And yet, from this crisis, Europe had begun to emerge transformed. The Renaissance, with its renewed interest in classical learning and human potential, the age of exploration, with its drive to discover new worlds and new possibilities. The Protestant Reformation, with its challenge to religious authority. All of these great movements of European history had their roots, at least in part, in the transformed world that emerged from the plague years. The Black Death had been Europe's greatest catastrophe, but it had also been, in ways that its victims could never have imagined, the beginning of Europe's transformation into the modern world. To truly understand the Black Death's journey across Europe, we must pause in our narrative, step back from the human drama of plague-stricken cities and abandoned villages, and examine the enemy itself, this invisible killer that brought a continent to its knees. For centuries, the exact nature of the Black Death remained a mystery. Medieval physicians, working with the limited knowledge of their time, proposed various explanations: corrupted air, unfavorable alignments of planets, divine punishment for human sin. They could observe the symptoms, document the disease's progress, but they could not see the true cause. It was not until the late 19th century, in the laboratories of scientists like Alexander Yersin and Shibasaburo Kitasato, that the bacterial cause of plague was finally identified. The organism they discovered, Yersinia pestis, named in honor of Yersin, turned out to be one of humanity's most ancient and persistent enemies. Imagine, if you will, this tiny bacterium, so small that millions could fit on the head of a pin, yet powerful enough to bring down empires. Yersinia pestis is what scientists call a gram-negative bacterium, rod-shaped, with a complex life cycle that involves multiple hosts, multiple modes of transmission, multiple ways of killing. In its primary form, plague is a disease of rodents, particularly ground squirrels, marmots, and rats. The bacteria live in the bloodstream of these animals, often without causing them harm, maintained in natural reservoirs that can persist for decades, centuries, even millennia in suitable environments. But the key to plague's deadly efficiency, the reason it could spread so rapidly across medieval Europe, lies not with its primary hosts, but with its vectors, the fleas that feed on infected animals and then carry the bacteria to new victims. The oriental rat flea, Xenopsilla chaopis, proved to be plague's most effective ally. When a flea feeds on the blood of a plague-infected rat, the bacteria multiply rapidly in the flea's digestive system, eventually blocking the flea's ability to feed normally. The starving flea, desperate for nourishment, bites repeatedly, regurgitating plague bacteria into each wound, turning every bite into a potential death sentence. In medieval Europe, rats were everywhere, in granaries and warehouses, in ships' holds and city streets, in the walls of houses and the foundations of churches. Where humans lived, rats lived too. And where rats lived, fleas lived in abundance. The great trade routes that connected medieval Europe, those pathways of silk and spices, of amber and furs, were also highways for rats and fleas. A ship sailing from Crimea to Genoa, a wagon train traveling from Venice to Bruges, a merchant caravan crossing the Alpine passes. All carried their invisible passengers, their hidden cargo of death. The disease that resulted from plague infection took several forms, each terrifying in its own way. Bubonic plague, the most common form, attacked the lymphatic system, causing the swollen, painful masses called buboes that gave the disease its name. These swellings, often as large as eggs or apples, appeared most commonly in the groin, the armpits, the neck, marking the body's desperate attempt to fight off the infection. Victims of bubonic plague faced a mortality rate of perhaps 60 to 70%. Horrible odds, but still leaving room for hope, for recovery, for survival. But plague had other, deadlier forms. Septicemic plague occurred when the bacteria entered the bloodstream directly, overwhelming the body's defenses before buboes could even form. Victims of septicemic plague often died within days, sometimes within hours, their skin turning dark with internal bleeding, their organs failing one by one. Most terrifying of all was pneumonic plague, which attacked the lungs, turning victims into living weapons of disease transmission. Unlike bubonic plague, which required flea bites for transmission, pneumonic plague could spread directly from person to person, through coughing, through breathing, through the simple act of speaking to an infected individual. It was probably pneumonic plague that spread most rapidly through the crowded cities of medieval Europe, racing through households and neighborhoods, monasteries and markets, turning every human contact into a potential death sentence. The mortality rate for pneumonic plague approached 100%, making it one of the most lethal diseases in human history. Medieval medical response. Medieval physicians, faced with a disease they could not understand, tried desperately to find effective treatments. They bled patients, believing that corrupt blood was the cause of illness. They burned aromatic herbs, thinking that sweet smells could counteract the corrupted air that seemed to carry the disease. Some treatments, by accident rather than design, may have provided limited benefit. The practice of quarantine, isolating the sick from the healthy, could slow the spread of infection. The use of certain herbs and spices, while not curative, may have had some antiseptic properties, but by and large, medieval medicine was helpless against the plague. Physicians died alongside their patients. Monasteries that served as hospitals became charnel houses, and the disease continued its relentless advance across a continent that had no effective means of resistance. Understanding the true nature of Yersinia pestis, its complex life cycle, its multiple forms, its devastating efficiency, helps us appreciate the magnitude of what medieval Europe faced. This was not simply a disease, but a perfect biological weapon, evolved over millions of years to exploit the very networks of trade and communication that had made European civilization possible. The Black Death succeeded not because medieval people were ignorant or careless, but because they faced an enemy that was perfectly adapted to their world, an invisible invisible killer that turned their greatest strengths, their connectivity, their commerce, their community, into instruments of their own destruction. To truly understand the Black Death's impact on medieval Europe, we must listen to the voices of those who lived through it, the chroniclers and poets, the merchants and clergy, the common people who left behind fragmentary records of their experiences during those terrible years. These voices speak to us across the centuries, sometimes in formal Latin chronicles, sometimes in vernacular poems and songs, sometimes in simple notations in account books or legal records. They tell us not just what happened, but how it felt to live through the end of the world. For that is how many experienced the plague years. Let us listen, dear friends, to these voices from the darkness and try to understand what they can teach us about human nature in extremis, about fear and faith, despair and hope, death and survival. From Italy, Giovanni Boccaccio, that great writer who witnessed the plague's assault on Florence, left us perhaps the most vivid account of urban devastation. In the introduction to his Decameron, he wrote of streets empty except for the dead and dying, of families destroyed in a matter of days, of social bonds dissolving under the pressure of terror. How many valiant men, how many fair women, how many fine young fellows, Boccaccio observed, breakfast with their kinsfolk, and that same night supped with their ancestors in the next world. His words capture not just the speed with which the plague killed, but the way it shattered the normal rhythms of medieval life, turning morning into evening, life into death, in the space of a single day. But Boccaccio also wrote of human resilience, of the young people who fled plague-stricken Florence and spent 10 days telling stories, entertaining themselves with tales of love and adventure, comedy and tragedy, even in the face of apocalypse. The human spirit sought beauty, sought meaning, sought connection with others. From England, the chronicler Henry Knighton left us a different kind of account, more statistical, more concerned with the plague's economic and social impact. He wrote of villages completely depopulated, of fields lying fallow because there were no hands to tend them, of livestock wandering freely because their owners had died. In this year, Knighton recorded, there was a general mortality of people throughout the whole world. The phrase "throughout the whole world" captures something important about medieval perceptions of the plague. This sense that the catastrophe was universal, that nowhere was safe, that the very foundations of existence had been shaken. The clergy, who faced the plague as both spiritual guides and practical caregivers, left particularly poignant accounts. In many cases, they died in disproportionate numbers, called by duty to minister to the sick, to comfort the dying, to bury the dead. The Archbishop of Canterbury, writing to his bishops in 1348, acknowledged that the contagious pestilence of the present day, which is spreading far and wide, has left many parish churches and other livings without parson or priest to care for their parishioners. This simple administrative note tells a profound story of priests who stayed at their posts until death claimed them, of communities left without spiritual guidance at their moment of greatest need, of a church hierarchy struggling to maintain basic functions in the face of unprecedented losses. But we also have accounts of clerical courage, of priests who continued their work despite the danger, of monasteries that remained open to care for plague victims, of religious communities that maintained their devotional life even as death stalked their cloisters. French nobility. From France, we have the testimony of Jean de Venette, a chronicler who witnessed the plague's assault on the Île-de-France, the heartland of the French kingdom. His account captures the way the plague disrupted not just individual lives, but entire social structures. After the aforesaid pestilence, he wrote, many buildings, both large and small in all cities, towns and villages, remained empty and deserted. But he also noted how survivors adapted, how the shortage of workers led to higher wages, how young people inherited responsibilities that would normally have come to them only after decades of service. Perhaps most interesting are the accounts that describe changes in social behavior, the way the plague altered relationships between different classes, different communities, different generations. Some observers noted increased charity, a sense that shared suffering had created new bonds of sympathy. Others described the opposite, communities torn apart by suspicion, by the search for scapegoats, by the desperate desire to find someone to blame for the inexplicable catastrophe. The persecution of Jewish communities, the attacks on foreigners and strangers, the breakdown of normal social restraints. Most moving of all, perhaps, are the personal accounts, the letters and diary entries, the marginal notes in manuscripts, that give us glimpses into individual experiences of loss and survival. A merchant in Prato writing to his business partner, described the death of his entire family in a matter of days, his own survival as somehow shameful, his struggle to find meaning in a world that no longer made sense. A nun in a German convent, copying a religious manuscript, added a note in the margin, "Here ends the world." 3 words that capture the medieval sense that the plague represented not just a medical crisis, but the literal end of the age, the beginning of the final tribulation that would precede the last judgment. Yet alongside these accounts of despair, we find others that speak of unexpected joy, of love discovered in dark times, of friendships forged in shared adversity, of communities that emerge stronger from their trial by fire. These voices from the plague years teach us something profound about human nature, about our capacity for both despair and hope, both cruelty and compassion, both breakdown and renewal. They remind us that even in the darkest times, people continue to love, to create, to hope, to dream of better days ahead. The Black Death was a catastrophe beyond imagining, but it was also, in ways that its victims could hardly have understood, a crucible that forged new forms of human experience, new ways of thinking about life and death, society and individual, earth and heaven. These medieval voices, speaking to us across 7 centuries, tell us not just about plague and death, but about the enduring strength of the human spirit, the capacity to find meaning even in meaninglessness, hope even in hopelessness, life even in the very face of death. The great mortality of 1347 to 1351 was not the end of Europe's plague story, but only the beginning. Like a tide that retreats only to return with renewed force, the Black Death would revisit Europe again and again over the following centuries. Each outbreak a reminder that the medieval world's greatest enemy had not been conquered, only temporarily appeased. The plague returned in 1361 to 1362 in what contemporaries called the mortality of children, claiming disproportionately those who had been born since the first outbreak, those who lacked the immunity that some survivors of the initial plague seemed to possess. Again in 1369, again in 1334, 1375, again in 1390. The plague swept across never with quite the devastating force of the first outbreak, but always with enough power to remind people that their world remained fragile, their lives precarious, their civilization built on foundations that could shift without warning. London, that great city that had been brought to its knees in 1348-1349, faced the plague's return repeatedly. The bills of mortality, those grim weekly tallies of the dead, became a regular feature of London life, a statistical reminder of death's constant presence. 1603, 1625, 1636, 1665, each date marking another visitation, another time when Londoners barricaded themselves in their homes, when the wealthy fled to the countryside, when the poor faced death with whatever resources they could muster. The Great Plague of London in 1665, immortalized in Daniel Defoe's Journal of a Plague Year, showed how little had really changed in 3 centuries of plague experience. The same flight to the countryside, the same breakdown of social order, the same desperate search for medical remedies, the same ultimate helplessness before the invisible enemy. Across Europe, the pattern repeated. Marseille in 1720 to 1722, the last great plague outbreak in Western Europe, showed that even in the age of enlightenment, even in an era of scientific revolution and medical advancement, plague could still bring a great city to its knees. The disease that had first arrived with medieval merchant ships continued to follow the same pathways, the same ports and trade routes, the same urban centers where people lived in close proximity. Each outbreak followed the same terrible logic, the same progression from isolated cases to general mortality, from hope to despair, from order to chaos. But gradually, almost imperceptibly, Europe began to develop defenses, not medical defenses. The bacterial cause of plague would not be discovered until the 1890s. Not effective treatments. Antibiotics lay centuries in the future. Instead, Europe developed social and administrative defenses, systems of quarantine and isolation, methods of tracking and containing outbreaks. Venice, which had suffered so terribly in the first plague outbreak, became a pioneer in plague prevention. The Venetian system of quarantine, That 40-day isolation of ships and goods arriving from infected areas became a model copied across Europe. Lazarettos, those isolation hospitals built on remote islands or outside city walls, provided a way to separate the sick from the healthy, to break the chain of transmission that had allowed plague to spread so rapidly in the 14th century. Bills of health, documents certifying that ships came from plague-free ports, became essential papers for maritime commerce. The free flow of goods and people that had characterized medieval trade, and that had allowed plague to spread so easily, was gradually replaced by a more regulated, more cautious system. Medical evolution. Medicine, too, began to evolve, slowly and often incorrectly, but with a growing sense that plague was a natural phenomenon, not a supernatural punishment that could potentially be understood and combated. The rise of empirical observation, the careful recording of symptoms and treatments, the comparison of different outbreaks, gradually built up a body of knowledge about plague behavior. While still far from accurate understanding, this knowledge provided some foundation for more effective responses. Perhaps most importantly, European society adapted psychologically to plague's recurring presence. What had been unthinkable catastrophe in 1347 became, while never routine, at least comprehensible disaster by the 17th century. Plague literature, plague prayers, plague laws, all became part of European culture. People learned to live with the knowledge that plague might return, that their lives remained precarious, that death could come suddenly and without warning. This knowledge, rather than paralyzing society, seemed in many ways to energize it, to create a sense of urgency about life, a determination to accomplish what could be accomplished while time remained. Even the physical landscape of Europe bore plague's mark. The great Gothic cathedrals, many of them begun before the Black Death, took on new meaning as monuments to mortality, as statements of faith in the face of inexplicable suffering. Plague churches, built to house the vast numbers of dead, changed urban landscapes across Europe. Plague columns, those Baroque monuments that marked the end of outbreaks, became common features in Central European cities. Permanent reminders of temporary disasters. Economically, Europe learned to function with the knowledge that plague might disrupt trade, destroy harvests, eliminate entire skilled trades overnight. This knowledge encouraged diversification, the development of more flexible economic structures, the creation of systems that could adapt quickly to sudden changes, the rise of insurance, the development of credit systems that could function across distances and delays, the growth of banking networks that could survive local disasters, all reflected Europe's adaptation to a world made uncertain by plague. By the 18th century, plague had largely retreated from Western Europe, driven back not by medical conquest, but by changes in European society, improvements in housing that reduced rat populations, changes in trade patterns that interrupted transmission routes, administrative systems that could respond more quickly to outbreaks. Eastern Europe continued to face plague outbreaks into the 19th century, and the disease remained endemic in parts of Asia and Africa. But for most Europeans, plague had become a historical memory rather than a present threat, a nightmare from which their continent had finally awakened. The long echo of plague, stretching across 4 centuries of European history, reminds us that the Black Death was not a single event, but a process, not a momentary catastrophe, but a fundamental alteration in the human condition. Europe had learned to live with death, to plan for disaster, to find meaning in the face of meaninglessness. In learning these lessons, medieval and early modern Europeans had created something new, a civilization that was both more fragile and more resilient than what had come before, more aware of its mortality and more determined to transcend it, more humble before nature and more ambitious in its human aspirations. The plague had been Europe's greatest teacher and its harshest master, and the continent that emerged from centuries of plague experience was prepared in ways its people could not have imagined for the challenges and opportunities of the modern world. And so, dear listeners, we come to the end of our journey through time, our passage through the dark years when the Black Death swept across medieval Europe like a tide of sorrow, transforming everything it touched, leaving nothing unchanged in its wake. We have followed the plague's path from the distant steppes of Central Asia, through the great trading cities of the East, across the Mediterranean in those fateful ships of 1347, into the ports and markets, the villages and cities, the castles and cathedrals of medieval Europe. We have seen how this invisible enemy, smaller than the smallest insect, brought low the greatest kingdoms, emptied the most populous cities, silenced the most learned scholars, defeated the most valiant knights, worlds. We have witnessed the collapse of certainties that had seemed eternal, the shattering of assumptions that had seemed unshakable. But we have also seen something else, something perhaps more important than death and devastation. We have seen the resilience of the human spirit, the capacity to endure, to adapt, to find meaning, even in the face of meaninglessness, to rebuild even when everything has been destroyed. The Europe that emerged from the plague years was not the same continent that had existed before 1347. It was smaller in population, but perhaps richer in possibility, more aware of mortality, but more determined to make the most of life, more humble before nature, but more ambitious in its human projects. The Renaissance, with its celebration of human potential, the age of exploration, with its drive to discover new worlds, the scientific revolution, with its determination to understand nature's secrets. All of these great movements of European history had their roots, at least in part, in the transformed world that emerged from the plague years. Medieval people faced their great trial with the resources they had, with faith and reason, with courage and compassion, with all the tools that centuries of civilization had given them. They could not see the bacteria that was killing them, could not understand the complex ecological relationships that had brought plague to their world, could not cure the disease that was devastating their societies. But they could and did continue to love, to create, to hope, to dream of better days ahead. They buried their dead with ceremony, cared for their sick with tenderness, maintained their communities with determination, passed on their knowledge and their values to the generations that would come after. In this, perhaps, lies the true lesson of the Black Death's journey across Europe. Not that human beings are helpless before natural disaster, not that civilization is fragile and temporary, not that death always wins in the end. Rather, that human beings, faced with the worst that nature and fate can bring, continue to be human, continue to find ways to give meaning to suffering, to create beauty in the midst of destruction, to build hope on the foundation of despair. The Black Death changed Europe forever, but it did not destroy the essential human capacity for renewal, for growth, for the creation of something better, from the ruins of what had been lost. In this, the plague years were not just an ending, but also a beginning, not just a death, but also a birth, not just the close of medieval Europe's story, but the opening chapter of something new. And with that thought, dear listeners, we close our journey through the darkness and return to the light, carrying with us the voices of those who lived through Europe's greatest trial, and the knowledge that human beings, however fragile individually, are remarkably resilient as a species, remarkably creative in the face of destruction, remarkably hopeful even in the darkest times. The Black Death's journey across Europe is ended, but the human journey, of which it was just one chapter, continues still, continues in us, continues in all those who remember the past, learn from its lessons, and work to build a better future. Thank you for joining me on this journey through time, through darkness and light, through death and renewal. May you rest well, dream peacefully, and wake tomorrow ready to write your own chapter in the great continuing story of human experience.